a bipartisan vote of over 300 members of Congress ousting him. It includes about half, about 47% of current Republican members of Congress, who came to view Santos as just too costly.
I have been convicted of no crimes, Mr. Speaker.
He has manufactured his entire life.
He blatantly stole from his campaign.
Mr. Santos used tragic events in history to try and propel himself to public office. He can defend himself in a court of law, but for the purposes of this body, he's got to go.
Got to go, and he went. Today's vote also narrows these House Republicans' slim majority. They can now only lose 3 votes from their Republican caucus. And the nation saw how that kind of very narrow margin can strengthen the hand of hardline defectors. That's what helped Matt Gaetz. There were so few votes to be lost that he could get a couple of people and hold leverage over the speaker, or as we all remember, change the speaker. And that is also one of the raw pieces of political math that formed the reason why Republicans were holding back on this move they finally made today. But George Santos's lies and misconduct and now alleged crimes snowballed into something that the Republican Party clearly wanted to publicly break away from before this coming election next November. That's when Santos was, of course, already slated to leave Congress anyway.
Santos confessed he had never worked directly for Goldman Sachs and Citigroup.
What was going on inside you?
Look, Greg, here's the deal. I would have never gotten the nomination from the Nassau County GOP if I had not concluded college.
A Republican congressman is now accused of scamming a disabled veteran who was trying to raise money for his dying dog's cancer treatment.
Saying on his campaign website that his mother was Jewish and his grandparents escaped the Nazis during World War II. I never claimed to be Jewish, Santos said. I said I was Jew-ish.
In a tweet last year, Santos said 9/11 claimed my mother's life.
Immigration records obtained by NBC News show that Santos's mother was not even in the U.S. when 9/11 happened.
I've been a terrible liar on those subjects. This wasn't about tricking anybody.
It is a lot. And the House Ethics Committee report added details and evidence. It gave other members of Congress the argument that at least some fair and full process was used here. And that would be a contrast to the first attempt to expel Santos, which we should remind you tonight as we follow this news. The first attempt failed. That came before the Ethics Committee finished its work. Now, even if you put George Santos and everything you just heard to refresh your memory, put that to the side for a moment. Let's be clear. There can be hard governing questions about how Congress chooses to override the voters' will to completely boot members. A fair factual process matters, and history has not always redeemed some of Congress's approach here, like how the House actually targeted the first ever black committee chair, Adam Clayton Powell, in a related legislative plot to exclude, that was the word they used, rather than expel that member. Now, if you want to look that up or remember it, I'll tell you tonight, the Supreme Court ultimately reversed that move 7-1. Now, the lesson is not, I don't think, that Congress can never have a standard for booting members, but that there must be facts, due process, and a pretty high bar. You turn that back to Santos, the now former congressman, is actually the first member expelled in 2 decades, and the first whose conduct was deemed by his colleagues so extreme that he was expelled without either a criminal conviction or literally taking up arms against the U.S. Here's how the New York Times reports that tonight. This move today consigned Santos to a genuine place in history, the first person to be expelled from the House without first being convicted of a federal crime or supporting the Confederacy. 3 House members who have been expelled before Santos were, for example, slave-owning Confederacy supporters at a time where that was no longer deemed acceptable in the United States Congress. Now, for his part, I should take care to also mention that Mr. Santos is still legally presumed innocent on the criminal cases. He faces 23 felony counts related to fraud and misconduct. He proclaimed his innocence, and there will be a trial that's scheduled for next year. So, breathe in, breathe out. That is the news, a little bit of the history, and that already is a lot. Today, Congress did draw a line, and it did so with many people in both parties standing up to these lies in government. So that's a major and unusual storyline. But I want to tell you tonight, and I want to take a little more time to walk through this because it matters, there's actually more here than just that. If tonight marks a stand against government lies and the damage they can do, most of the House Republicans taking this rare, strong measure against these lies also are failing to bring that standard to the big lie, to the way Donald Trump abused power to deceive millions about his election loss, a lie that fed an insurrection. And I want to be very clear about this. This is not some freewheeling, broad effort to tie these things together. We are talking about lies in government and whether there's accountability and what Republicans say they did today and what they're actually doing. And as a matter of news standards, we do not need to say Trump's lie allegedly fed the insurrection. We can report for you it is a fact that it did so. It is a fact that Trump lost the election. It is a fact that his lies and his demand that his fans come to Washington to act on those lies fed the crowd, populated the crowd, which then stormed the Capitol and committed what is now legally a convicted sedition that day. That's a reality and a legal fact. Now, whether Donald Trump himself, as a defendant, is ultimately convicted is a separate and open question. But to be clear, just as Santos has not yet been convicted, the lie part of that equation is not an open question. And if anyone knows how it went down, it is those members of Congress, including the Republicans, who were giving speeches, they said, against lies today. They were standing on the very floor that those Trump fans, and now convicted seditionists, some of them, stormed and ransacked because of the power of lies. And I say this quite literally, and I want to spell it out quite precisely. That day was not billed as some sore loser party. It was not sold that way. And that's not what those now convicted seditionists mostly said or thought, and we know that even beyond propaganda from their private texts and messages with each other. It was a response to Donald Trump's lies about, quote, stopping the steal. Lies from a far more powerful member of government than George Santos about much more important matters than Mr. Santos's job history or Botox or really the rest of the stuff that we no longer have to cover that much in the news. There was danger posed to Congress. There was an attack on American democracy itself. So keep that in mind, and the Republicans' ongoing support for that lie and the way they voted against the certification at the time and sided with Trump after and continue to do so today as he is their main candidate to go back into the White House. Keep that all in mind as you make sense of this story tonight, because as I said, it is rare and it is a big deal, but also keep it in mind as you listen to what is about half the Republican caucus and some of the others who criticize Santos and maybe didn't vote against him as they claim outrage over government lies.
He defrauded the voters of his district. His life was made up. It was a lie.
I think the right decision was reached today. That this is by far the worst corruption that we've seen, where an individual member has not chosen to resign.
George Santos should have resigned, and actually any other person in his situation likely would have.
Any other person should resign. Well, forget resign. How about unapologetically run for the highest office in the land while vowing pardons and sweetheart deals for people now convicted of sedition against the United States government? It doesn't take a lot of mental work here to sub out Santos, a relatively obscure, new, now former congressman, and the person they are actually trying to put in charge of the country and your life and your vote and maybe the future of our democracy. Defendant Trump faces criminal evidence on more serious charges than Santos. That's a fact. As for the examples here with the Republicans, take Congressman Max Miller, who as a staffer helped plan the January 6th rally, who backed Trump post-coup, and then wants to tell his district, perhaps people concerned about this going into the election, that he stands against lies and fraud if they're by George Santos.
I myself have been a victim of George Santos and as well as other members of Congress in terms of defrauding through public donations.
I'm running for Congress to stand up for what is right for the people of Northeast Ohio. They have made their values clear at the ballot box. Their congressman betrayed them anyway. I'm Max Miller, and I will never betray our voters. That's why President Trump endorsed me. I refuse to let him down.
Or take two more examples. These are Republicans who took the rare step to oust Santos, they said again, over the lies and fraud, while actively backing Donald Trump's lies, which fed the attack on their very workplace and safety, among other things, on Jan 6.
I talked to one of the Capitol Police. They told me a lot of people were just milling around.
John, can you help lead the efforts to overturn the 2020? You don't need that light.
Now, we just went through some of the details, the history, even the nuance about what it takes for Congress to disqualify people. But this is more than just a story about the now former Congressman George Santos or whatever happens to him. Because it got so bad, politically, publicly, and otherwise, that even this Republican MAGA party had to come in and say, we stand against these lies. And they're, I guess, hoping that nobody will look around at the other obvious cloud of the big lie hanging over all of this. And we live in a time where we are told maybe nothing matters and nobody's paying attention and everyone's fatigued. But if that were true, they wouldn't have to do this. They would just move on and roll into the next year. They wanted to get this done. They didn't want to just let him go off quietly. He said he wasn't running against anyway. And that's a reminder that actually the facts matter, that reporting and public pressure and information matters, that there's some quantum of voters that these Republicans care about. Again, these are Republicans, 47% of them that did this anti-lie vote today. And yet they are now stuck going into an election year with their big lie candidate. So I put it a lot of different ways with some nuance, but to end it as simply as possible, it is a tough day for a lot of MAGA Republicans because their position literally boils down to small lie, bad. Big lie, good.